Beech B-35V Bonanza that was being operated by a private pilot named Warren Sinclair broke up in flight during an instrument approach and crashed close to Omaha's Eppley Airfield. There were 3 passengers on board the plane that night, with only 1 survivor. Among the passengers, Warren Sinclair, who was a 46-year-old private single-engine land pilot with an instrument rating with 1,700 hours. His wife, Margaret, was 42 years old at the time, and their daughter, Allison, was 18 years old at the time. Allison held a private single-engine land pilot's license with an instrument rating just like her father. Unfortunately, Allison was the only one to survive the crash, but she was still seriously injured. Prior to the flight, the family had spent 3 days in Albuquerque along with Santa Fe. They were planning on heading back to Omaha where their airplane was based out of. The aircraft was on an IFR flight plan, and they had planned to depart from Santa Fe at 7 p.m. The trip would approximately take them 3 hours and 55 minutes. The plane had 5 hours of fuel on board. The flight plan had been filed as direct from Santa Fe to Omaha at 13,000 feet initial altitude and then 9,000 feet after they had cleared the mountain. In order to achieve the 13,000 feet altitude, they had equipped oxygen systems. The weather at Santa Fe was cloudy, meaning that the sky was clear and visibility was at least 10 kilometers. En route, the weather was forecast to be deteriorating to around 5 miles visibility, 600-foot ceilings after Garden City, Kansas. There was also forecasted to be a chance of light rain or snow. The winds at 9,000 feet were expected to be from 280 degrees at 30 knots, and at 12,000 feet they were expected to be 300 degrees at 45 knots. Sinclairs had a relaxed dinner and then did a thorough pre-flight walk-around of their plane, and everything seemed to be in order. The Bonanza was properly loaded and the CFG requirements were met. The weather in Santa Fe was great and they had no issues on takeoff. As they reached 9,000 feet, they all put on their oxygen masks. They reached their intended altitude of 13,000 feet within 10 minutes of taking off. We have on the show today Bob Sinclair, the ATC controller from the night of the accident, a NASA representative, and an NTSB representative in order to shed some more light on this accident.
Wow, this Santa Fe weather is really nice.
Yeah, honey, it's gorgeous.
I'm only a little bit worried about the weather at Omaha. It's forecast to get worse.
Don't be nervous.
But if anything, we'll just divert and go visit Grandpa and Grandma.
Wow, that's a good idea.
Okay, so we're gonna climb to 13,000 feet, and before that we'll put on our oxygen mask. After we cross the mountains, we'll descend to 9,000 and we can take off our oxygen mask. We'll probably
13,000 feet? Isn't that very high?
It's what we need to get over the mountain. After that, I'll change seats with Allison, she'll fly a bit, and then we'll rotate again, and then maybe she can come back when we're about to land.
That sounds like a good idea.
Hey Dad,
Okay.
you switching off the oxygen system?
Yes. We're at 9,000 feet now, Allison. Do you want to hop up front so I can go back and take a nap?
Yeah, no problem. Alright, so Dad, you'll take over once we get back into near Omaha, right?
Yes.
Alright. So how long should I wake you up in?
Just wake me up in about a half an hour
Okay.
to an hour.
Alright. No problem.
I didn't sleep too well.
Yeah, you must have slept for like nearly an hour there.
Yeah, I didn't get very good sleep.
Yeah, you're still tired, eh? I'm gonna take a nap, Dad, but wake me up before we approach.
Yeah, we'll wake you up before.
Alright. Dad, why didn't you wake me up? And why is there so much ice on the wings? And why are you going so fast?
There's a 727 behind us. I want to try and get down before he reaches us. Oh no!
So we're here today with Bob Sinclair, and he's going to talk to us about the accident that occurred at Omaha Epi Field involving his parents and his sister. So, Bob, did your parents wake your sister up before the approach?
From what I was told, no, they did not wake Allison up. I guess it's because Dad figured he could just handle it on his own. But when she did wake up, Dad was being given a vector to Gurphy, which is the outer marker for runway 14, right at Epley.
So where would you say you guys were at this point?
At that point, they were about 15 miles out, and Allison heard the controller tell Dad that there was another aircraft inbound on the localizer, about 25 miles from the marker. I believe the controller said it was a 727.
What was your dad's response?
Dad told him that he would be able to make the turn onto the localizer right at Gurphy so that they could beat the 727. The controller gave him a heading and told him to check his speed.
So they must have been going pretty fast.
Yes. Allison said that Dad was redlining the engine.
Were they simply trying to get ahead of the 727, or were there other factors that were causing it to go so fast?
I think it was a combination of that and the fact that their wings were starting to pick up ice. So Dad was probably trying to create a buffer due to the ice causing more drag.
Did Allison believe that your dad was in control of the airplane throughout the whole situation at the time?
Well, Allison said that he looked really uptight, but that's probably because us St. Clairs are extremely scared of ice, so we're not very fond of it, right? But his airspeed was just below the red line, and when asked about it, he said that he was watching it and that he just wanted to get ahead of the airliner.
So what happened next?
So after that, when they were 2 miles out, the controller cleared them for the approach and told Dad that the 727 would be about 8 miles behind them. So when they reach Gurphy, they would have enough space to slow down and get set up for landing. The 14 right approach is a tight one. The marker is only about 3.6 miles from the runway, and you don't get much time to get set up with your flaps and wheels down after you're on the glide slope. But from what Allison told me, Dad never slowed down and he never put the flaps down at that point. I guess he wanted to be extra sure that they would beat the 727, and he must have been feeling some mushiness in the controls with the ice that was apparently building up on the wings.
So when did things really start to go wrong?
Basically, after they turned onto the localizer beam, Allison says Dad swung the airplane into a steep right turn and pulled the nose up and tried to reach for the landing gear switch, but he never got there because they had entered a spiral dive. Allison says the next thing she remembers is
waking up in the hospital.
She must have been devastated.
She was.
Given what you know about the incident, do you think your dad could have safely landed the plane had he been going a little bit slower?
Yes, I think they likely would all still be alive if Dad had slowed down the plane, which simply wasn't designed to handle such high stresses.
Well, Bob, thanks for talking to us. We really appreciate your time, and we're really sorry for your loss.
Thanks for having me.
We were lucky to be able to get an interview with one of NASA's representatives who investigated the crash, and he's here with us today. So what were your thoughts when you heard about the accident?
At first, we were all shocked that there was a survivor. This is rarely the case with accidents involving in-flight breakups. The fact that Allison Sinclair was a pilot and a survivor meant that we would be able to get a lot of insight as to the causes and circumstances of the accident.
How did you go about investigating an accident like this?
Well, the first thought that comes to mind is, did the pilot overstress the airplane, or did the airplane fall apart on its own? But either cases, possibility raises several questions such as, was it a case of both too much stress by the pilot, but also mechanical and environmental factors that contributed to the breakup? However, the ultimate question is, can something be done to prevent these killer accidents? But since both the FAA and the manufacturer are working on the actual structure of the plane, we at NASA focus on the human factors.
So, what do you mean by human factors?
First of all, human factors can be separated into actions and causes. Actions are easier to identify because they're black and white, whereas the causes are not so easy.
Could you walk us through his actions?
We know that about 2 hours into the flight, Warren took a nap that turned into a continuous, deeper sleep of nearly an hour. After waking up from that, he was still quite tired and had to stretch and move around in order to shake off the heavy head. This indicates that his resting position was probably poor, which left him slightly disorientated and lightheaded. His abrupt suggestion that Allison get some sleep so that she could help him later on showed that he was thinking about his and her physical condition. Then after an hour, Warren and his wife made the irresponsible decision to let Allison continue sleeping instead of waking her up and having her as a useful co-pilot. Conditions hadn't changed in Omaha, but the pilot was now confident that he wouldn't need any help.
Could it have been something to do with his orientation?
Yes. He was disorientated an hour earlier, which makes it safe to assume that it had become worse.
What symptoms did he have when he arrived into Omaha airspace?
The pilot was exhibiting visible stress, as we know from Allison's description of him seeming uptight. His airspeed was elevated, there was ice on the wings, and his answer was innocuous when Allison asked him why he was flying so close to the red line. When Allison pointed out that there was ice, he didn't answer at all. These are all signs of extreme tension in a person who has been described as well-disciplined, cool under pressure, and always in command. Warren's speed was excessive. The pilot's radio responses weren't completely logical, and his decision to intercept the localizer right at the marker made no sense. Things only got worse. He didn't slow down when advised to do so. He never put flaps down and didn't think to lower the landing gear until he was in a violent turn.
So it's safe to say that the pilot let the plane get ahead of him?
Yes, Warren was experiencing a deteriorating mental and physical state, aggravated by the worsening weather and made complicated by the traffic pressure.
You've talked about the reactions, so what about the causes?
The causes can be traced back as far as when the Bonanza first arrived in Albuquerque. The family comes from Omaha, approximately 1,000 feet above sea level, and landed at an elevation of 5,352 feet. That big of a difference often makes people a bit lethargic and takes a few days to get used to. The family stayed there for 2 days and then went to Santa Fe, which is another 1,000 feet higher, which for sure didn't help them at all. It might even be the reason why they made their first questionable decision to make a 4-hour night flight back to Omaha, which was something they had never done. It had been stated by the son and daughter that the family rarely flew cross-country in VFR, so to do one IFR over mountainous terrain is very strange.
The Bonanza was equipped with air canisters, so shouldn't that have helped with their altitude?
Well, yes, the air helped them while they were at 13,000 feet, but then they turned it off after descending to 9,000 feet. This isn't uncommon because the not common practice to use oxygen when below 10,000 feet. While flying at 9,000 feet for 2.5 hours, the family slowly became hypoxic. This is because the oxygen content of the air at 9,000 feet at night is the same as the oxygen level at 14 or 15,000 feet during daylight hours. This difference is even more exaggerated during winter months, keeping in mind that the accident happened in November.
So you saying that all their decisions were due to them being hypoxic?
Well, no, we're not 100% sure that this is the cause because we can't prove through any tests or autopsies the physical presence of hypoxia or the lack of oxygen in the human body. But what we do know is that the pilot's longer than intended naps, his slight-headedness after his awakening, his euphoric feeling of self-confidence, and finally, his complete lack of judgment and loss of control under pressure are signs of hypoxia.
Thanks for coming on the show today, and we appreciate your time.
You're welcome.
Thanks for coming on the show today. We really appreciate it.
No problem. I'm always happy to help raise awareness about the tragedy.
So, how familiar were you with the Sinclairs?
Well, everyone around here knew the Sinclairs. Warren was a prominent lawyer in town and a big supporter of the airport. He and his kids flew in and out of here in their Bonanza like they were out to break a record on shooting approaches. I bet Warren himself must have shot at least 200. Honestly, I'd say he probably knew every approach better than anyone around.
On the night of the incident, did you immediately identify that it was him over the radio?
When he first called in that night, I didn't recognize his voice, and believe me, I knew his voice. But he called in like he always did. He'd say, Epley, Bonanza 42 whiskey. He'd never give his full description like everybody else, but we all knew it was him. But anyway, he sounded not right to me that night, and he wasn't responding right either.
Did you ask him whether there was something wrong?
To be honest, things were happening so quickly and all of a sudden that I never did ask him if he was okay. But obviously, I now realize that he wasn't, and I do regret that, and that I didn't ask him.
At what point did you realize that things weren't right?
Well, I was expecting him, of course, but I realized pretty quickly that there was something wrong when his target first showed up about 45 miles out.
What made it so obvious?
What gave it away was his speed. From what I could tell, he was moving almost as fast as a jet, and he didn't make any initial calls from as far out as he normally did. I was just about to call him up myself by the time he contacted me.
Where was he when he called you?
He was about 18 or 20 miles southwest of the marker. We were busier than usual that night with freight and corporate stuff, and I told him we had a 727 a long way out on the localizer and a couple of other high-speed aircraft inbound. The truth is that I regret having told him about the 727 because he seemed to speed up even more. But anyways, he then asked me for a vector to the right, which was also unusual because he always asked me for 3 miles out so that he could get the plane set up to land on the glide slope.
What was your response?
Well, I asked him if he wouldn't like some cushion, but he said he wanted to get down in a hurry before the 727 beat him to the approach. But I told him that the 727 wouldn't be closer than 8 miles, which is a pretty decent distance, even if it took the 3 miles, but he just kept on coming.
Did you ever explicitly mention to him that he was not going to make the approach?
Yeah, I knew he was going to blow the entry, and I told him that. Bonanza simply can't turn that fast and at that high of a speed. But in response to my warning, he simply mumbled, "We'll be fine." But 20 seconds later, he was through the localizer course and back in a flash. From that point on, he lost it. He started a left turn back, but when he went back, he was straight ahead. That's when he went off my scope.
Well, thanks for coming on the show today. We appreciate your time.
No problem. We managed to get in contact with one of the NTSB representatives that was responsible for overseeing the investigation of the Epley accident. Hi, and thanks for coming on the show.
No problem, I was happy to help.
So my first question is, what does the NTSB believe was the cause of the accident?
Well, we have to get one thing straight. The NTSB doesn't subscribe to the position that any aircraft can come apart in an overstressed situation. There are many that won't.
The family of the two individuals who died in the crash and a few agencies have tried to blame the accident on the fact that the airplane had picked up ice. Does the NTSB agree with this position?
No, we don't agree with the survivors or these other agencies. We believe it was nothing more than pilot error. But let me explain that position in human terms because we believe with absolute certainty that this accident should have been avoided. For starters, we agree with the manufacturer as to what happened mechanically to the airplane. They believe that the plane was simply going too fast and turned too quickly. The combination of the two seriously overstressed the aircraft and could have taken the tail off without bonanza in flight. Discounting the ice and turbulence, both of which we cannot prove, and please keep in mind that proof is what this organization is all about, we have left the pilot who was flying the airplane. We know that he rarely flew long distances at night, but had some compelling reasons to do so this flight. That tells us that he was in a hurry. Next, he was told about a possible traffic, a 727 that has an approach speed substantially faster than a Bonanza. That tells us that there was extra pressure on it. And finally, we know from his daughter who survived the crash that by some miracle that there was apparently some ice on the wings. We certainly took her word for it, even though there was no ice on the wings after impact, and even though our report could only include known findings. We know from the daughter and the son that their father had a healthy respect for, or even an outright fear of it, and that he always avoided icing at all costs. So assuming that there was icing on the wing, at least while the aircraft was still flying, that gives us a strong clue that he may have experienced panic or at the very least extreme stress and tension. Putting the human equation together, then this pilot should have not been there.
So what do you think he should have done instead?
He should have flown to his alternate, where he would have been able to make a safe and uneventful landing just as soon as ice began accumulating fast enough to make him want to keep up a dangerous high speed to prevent the airplane from stalling. He had plenty of fuel and knew that the weather at his alternate was fine, but he decided to go for it anyways. This left him in a condition that he just wasn't capable of dealing with. And by the way, that by definition is pilot error. It's no different than a VFR pilot taking off into an IMF condition or an IFR pilot deliberately busting minimums.
What do you think might have caused him to make this poor judgment call?
We don't officially speculate on why pilots make many of the mistakes they do, but in this case, we can only assume that he had a very compelling reason to get to Omaha on that particularly evening and at that particular time.
Well, thanks for your time, and we're happy to have you on the show today.
No problem.
The first communication issue was between the Epley controller and Warren Sinclair. The controller noticed that Warren didn't sound right over the radio, and the controller also noticed that he wasn't responding right either. The controller also explained that he didn't call out from as far out as usual. This was a problem because it meant that everything was rushed once he did make his initial call. From the interview with the controller, it was also clear that Warren was ignoring a lot of the controller's recommendations and advice. The controller, for example, told him that he was going too fast, but he decided to ignore the controller's advice to slow down. He also ignored the information the controller communicated about the fact that the 737 wouldn't be any closer than 8 miles, so he could slow down without creating traffic conflict. But Warren insisted on keeping the speed up because he thought the 727 would be coming far faster than it was. In addition, he was worried about ice that was forming on the wing, so he felt that keeping the speed up would prevent the stall. Finally, the controller told him that he was going to miss the approach given his speed, and that he should just overshoot, but he thought that he could safely make it to the runway and continue to fly the approach, even though the controller told him not to. In fact, Warren told him, "We'll be fine," just before they made the fatal turn to the localizer. The communication between Warren and the controller broke down because Warren was not listening to the controller's advice. The NASA investigation into the crash revealed that Warren, his wife, and Allison may have all been under the influence of hypoxia. This is due to a lack of oxygen that leads people to make silly decisions and is likely what led Warren to communicate so poorly with the controller. It's also what likely made him decide not to wake up Allison before the approach into Epley. It also probably caused him to land at a much faster speed than he would have normally made the approach at. It's probably also what made him paranoid about the 727 that was behind him, but far enough that he could have made the approach at a normal speed. And finally, it was probably what caused him to ignore all of the controller's advice throughout his approach.
So, what can we conclude from all this? Well, there is reason to believe that the family would have been hypoxic from being at 9,000 feet for such an extended amount of time, especially at night. Many of Warren's actions are signs of hypoxia, but we cannot for certain say that the accident was caused by hypoxia, since there is no evidence. Based on personal accounts from Allison, it is also possible that there was icing on the plane, but that is also something that can't be proven. What we do know for certain is that the pilot was under a lot of pressure from possible weather and incoming traffic. As a result of his actions, he overstressed the plane during a tight turn at an extremely high speed, which ripped the tail off. But for now, the official cause of this horrific accident will be left as pilot error. Warren should have gone out from Allison. Allison is also a pilot with the same ratings as him, so there's no reason why she could. Being a pilot, flying IFR at night can take a toll on the mind and the body. So having a co-pilot would have relieved a lot of the pressure that was on board. When facing icing conditions, it is always best to divert to an aerodrome with better weather. There is no reason to risk the lives of you and your passenger, and it is never worth it regardless of the outcome.